This is a work of fiction. The night everything changed began with an envelope. It was small, white, and ordinary, yet by the time I finished reading what was inside, I understood that some families do not fall apart all at once. They come apart one quiet moment at a time, usually around a table where everyone is still pretending to smile. My name is Margaret Collins, and I had imagined my 70th birthday would be remembered for the laughter of my grandchildren, the smell of fresh apple pie, and one more evening surrounded by the people I loved most. Instead, it became the night I finally saw my family for who they had become. My husband, Richard, used to say that every family needed someone willing to keep setting the table. During our 43 years together, we hosted nearly every holiday dinner in our home. Thanksgiving always meant an extra folding table in the living room. Christmas meant lights wrapped around the porch railing and cinnamon rolls before sunrise. Birthdays meant homemade cakes, even after we could easily afford bakery desserts. Richard believed traditions held families together, and after he passed away 6 years earlier, I promised myself I would keep those traditions alive. Turning 70 felt important, not because of the number itself, but because I had reached an age where every gathering felt more valuable than the last. I spent nearly a week planning that dinner. I walked slowly through the grocery store with a handwritten list folded neatly inside my purse. I picked the ripest apples for the pie because Daniel had loved apple pie since he was a little boy. I bought fresh herbs instead of dried ones because Richard always insisted people could taste the difference. I even stopped by the florist and treated myself to white lilies for the dining room table. They reminded me of the flowers Richard planted outside our first home decades ago. The morning of my birthday, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet except for birds outside the kitchen window. I tied on my old blue apron, turned on soft jazz, and began cooking. By noon, the smell of roasted chicken, garlic, warm bread, and baked apples drifted through every room. The dining table looked exactly the way I hoped it would. Polished silverware, linen napkins, my best china, 8-place settings, every chair waiting for someone I loved. Around 5:30, I changed into a soft blue dress that had been hanging in my closet for months. I smiled at my reflection, adjusted a small pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 30th anniversary, and whispered, "You would have loved tonight." At exactly 6 o'clock, the first car pulled into the driveway. Daniel walked through the front door, carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. Vanessa followed with Emma and Lucas close behind. Soon the house filled with familiar voices, cheerful conversations, and the comforting sounds that had always made this place feel like home. We shared dinner, told old stories, laughed about childhood memories, and watched the grandchildren argue over the last dinner roll exactly as they always had. For a little while, I believed I had succeeded. I believed Richard had been right. Then, just after dessert, Vanessa reached into her handbag, slid a sealed white envelope across the table toward me, and said with a pleasant smile, "Margaret, before everyone leaves, there is just one small thing we all agreed we should settle tonight." The smile on Vanessa's face never changed as I reached for the envelope. I assumed it was a birthday card signed by everyone, perhaps with a family photo tucked inside. Instead, I unfolded 2 neatly printed pages covered with itemized charges. Every grocery receipt had been listed. The flowers on the table, the fresh herbs, the sparkling cider, the disposable containers for leftovers. Even the birthday candles had their own line. At the bottom was a carefully calculated total followed by a sentence that felt colder than the paper itself. Amount due from Margaret Collins. I looked at the pages once, then again, convinced I had misunderstood. The room had become strangely quiet. Emma was tracing circles on the edge of her dessert plate. Lucas was trying to balance a spoon on his finger, unaware that every adult had stopped speaking. I looked toward Daniel, expecting him to laugh and tell me it was an elaborate joke. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and avoided my eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "we all talked about it. Things are expensive now. Since you wanted everyone together, we thought this was the fairest solution." Fair. It was an ordinary word, yet I had never heard it sound so unfamiliar. Vanessa leaned forward with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. "Nobody wants you to feel taken advantage of either," she said pleasantly. "This way everything is transparent." Transparent. Another ordinary word that somehow made the room feel even colder. I glanced around the table. Nobody objected. Nobody appeared uncomfortable enough to speak. My grandchildren looked from one adult to another, sensing something had shifted even if they could not understand what it was. I realized children often recognize tension long before they understand its cause. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. My hands were steady. Richard had always believed that dignity revealed itself most clearly during uncomfortable moments. He used to tell me, "Never let someone else's behavior decide your own." Those words quietly returned to me as I stood from my chair. I walked to the hallway cabinet where I kept my checkbook beside an old wooden bowl filled with spare keys. For a brief moment, my eyes landed on the framed photograph of Richard smiling on our 40th anniversary. It almost felt as though he were watching silently from across the room. I returned to the table, wrote the check for the exact amount, signed my name without hesitation, and placed it inside the envelope. Vanessa accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Margaret. We really appreciate your understanding." Then, almost unbelievably, the conversation resumed. Daniel asked Lucas about baseball practice. Emma talked excitedly about learning a new piano piece. Someone laughed about highway traffic. Coffee was poured. Dessert plates were cleared. It was as though the envelope had never crossed the table at all. I answered questions politely whenever someone spoke to me, but inside, something had become remarkably still. The disappointment I expected never arrived. Instead, I felt an unfamiliar clarity settling quietly into place. For years I had believed generosity naturally created gratitude. Sitting at my own birthday table, I began wondering whether I had mistaken dependence for appreciation all along. The house felt larger after everyone left. It always did, but that night the silence carried a different weight. I gathered the dessert plates one by one, rinsing each one beneath warm water while the last traces of laughter faded from memory. A half-eaten slice of apple pie remained on Daniel's plate. When he was 8 years old, he used to ask for a second slice before he had even finished the first. Richard would laugh and pretend to negotiate with him, insisting one more bite of vegetables earned one more piece of pie. Those small moments had once seemed ordinary. Looking back, I realized they had been the richest years of my life. I dried the dishes carefully and returned each one to its place inside the old oak cabinet Richard had built himself. Nearly everything in this house carried his fingerprints in one way or another. The bookshelves, the window seat overlooking the backyard, even the dining table where the evening had quietly changed the course of my life. Before turning off the kitchen light, I noticed several containers of leftover food still sitting on the counter. Years ago, my family would have happily taken them home. Tonight, everyone had rushed out with surprising speed, leaving behind enough food to feed me for nearly a week. I smiled faintly at the thought. They had remembered to collect the check, but forgotten the homemade dinner they had claimed was so expensive. Upstairs, I could not sleep. Instead, I opened the hallway closet and removed an old photo album covered in faded blue fabric. Dust floated through the air as I carried it into the living room and settled into Richard's favorite chair beside the lamp. The first pages held photographs from Daniel's childhood. His first day of kindergarten. His little league team posing proudly with second-place trophies. Camping trips where he insisted on helping Richard build the fire even though he was too young to lift the larger pieces of wood. Every picture reminded me of a boy who once thanked us for everything, even the smallest things. Then the memories grew older. College graduation. Richard and I smiling proudly in the front row after years of working overtime to help pay tuition. Daniel's wedding, where Richard quietly wrote a check to cover unexpected reception expenses because the young couple looked overwhelmed. The purchase of their first home. I remembered the afternoon Daniel admitted they were a few $1,000s short for the down payment. Richard and I never hesitated. We considered it a gift, not a loan. We wanted them to begin married life without unnecessary worry. Another page revealed Emma as a newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. Vanessa had returned to work sooner than expected, and I gladly rearranged my retirement plans to babysit 3 days every week. Later came piano lessons, school trips, braces, birthday parties, and countless moments when I stepped in because family simply helped family. At least that was what Richard and I had always believed. As the evening grew later, the photographs slowly stopped looking like separate memories. Together they formed something else entirely. They revealed a pattern I had never paused long enough to recognize. Whenever life became difficult, they turned toward me. Whenever life became comfortable again, They quietly moved on until the next emergency appeared. I closed the album gently and rested both hands on its worn cover. The envelope from dinner had not created a new reality. It had simply pulled away the curtain hiding one that had existed for years. For the first time since Richard passed away, I found myself wondering whether generosity without boundaries had taught the people I loved the wrong lesson all along. The next morning began like every other Sunday. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor through the east-facing window, and the old coffee maker filled the room with its familiar aroma. For years, mornings like this had brought me comfort. This time they brought something different. Clarity. I carried my mug onto the back porch and watched a pair of cardinals land near Richard's vegetable garden, now mostly filled with wildflowers instead of tomatoes. He used to say that gardens revealed the truth about patience. You could not force anything to grow. You could only notice what had already taken root. Sitting there, I realized the same thing was true about families. What happened at my birthday dinner had not appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly for years while I kept watering it with kindness, believing gratitude would eventually bloom. Instead, expectation had taken its place. After breakfast, I opened a small drawer in my desk where I kept household records dating back nearly 20 years. Richard had always insisted on saving important documents. Good records tell honest stories, he often said. I smiled at the memory as I began sorting through folders labeled with careful handwriting. Home repairs, medical expenses, insurance, family gifts. I had not looked through many of those files since his passing. Within an hour, my dining room table was covered with neat stacks of paper. There were canceled checks for Daniel's college tuition, receipts from the furniture we had bought when he and Vanessa moved into their first house, records of monthly transfers during the year Daniel lost his job, statements showing payments for Emma's piano lessons and Lucas's orthodontic treatment. None of those discoveries upset me. Richard and I had made every one of those decisions together. We had wanted to help. What surprised me was something much quieter. Almost every folder ended the same way. There was rarely a thank you note, rarely a handwritten card, rarely even a simple message asking whether I needed anything in return. I had never noticed because I had never been looking. My attention drifted toward another folder labeled Vacations. Inside was a photograph from a family trip to the Smoky Mountains 5 years earlier. Everyone was smiling in front of a log cabin surrounded by towering pine trees. I remembered paying for that cabin after Vanessa explained that money was tight for everyone. At the time, Daniel promised they would plan the next vacation. The next vacation never happened. Instead, there had simply been another request. Then another. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. None of those moments felt cruel by themselves. Together, they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. My generosity had slowly become part of the family budget. It was no longer viewed as a gift. It had become an expectation. Around noon, my telephone chimed with a new message from Vanessa. Thank you again for last night. Everyone had such a wonderful time. We should do it again soon. I read the words twice. There was no mention of my birthday. No acknowledgement of the envelope. No hint that anything unusual had happened. I placed the phone face down on the table without replying. Then I looked once more at the organized piles of records surrounding me. For the first time in years, I was not thinking about what my family needed from me next. I was quietly asking a different question altogether. What would happen if I simply stopped being the answer to every problem they expected me to solve? The week after my birthday passed more quietly than I expected. Nobody mentioned the envelope. Nobody apologized. Family messages continued arriving as though nothing unusual had happened. Vanessa sent photographs of Emma practicing piano. Daniel asked whether I still had Richard's old chili recipe. Lucas proudly showed me the baseball glove he had received for making the All-Star team. I answered politely, but something inside me had changed. For the first time in years, I stopped feeling responsible for responding immediately. One Thursday afternoon, I drove to the grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner. As I turned into the baking aisle, I heard Vanessa's voice coming from the next row of shelves. I recognized the woman she was talking to from one of Emma's school events. I had no intention of listening, but then I heard my own name. Margaret loves doing everything, Vanessa said with a light laugh. Honestly, if you let her pay, everybody wins. The other woman chuckled politely. Vanessa continued without lowering her voice. She actually gets upset if someone else picks up the check. We finally convinced her to cover her own birthday dinner, and she did not even argue. They both laughed softly. Then came the sentence that quietly settled into my heart. Why? Spend our money when she insists on spending hers. There was no cruelty in Vanessa's tone. No anger. She sounded completely comfortable, as though she were describing a family tradition everyone should admire. That frightened me more than if she had been openly unkind. I slowly backed my shopping cart away before either of them noticed me. During the drive home, I did not cry. I simply replayed those words over and over. She did not believe she had taken advantage of me. She believed she had been smart enough to let me volunteer. Somewhere along the way, my generosity had become part of their financial planning. I was no longer a mother who occasionally helped. I had quietly become the backup account everyone expected to remain open forever. That evening, I walked into Richard's study and opened the top drawer of his old desk. Inside was a worn leather notebook where he used to write ideas, reminders, and little observations about life. I turned several pages before one sentence caught my attention. When appreciation disappears, kindness slowly becomes obligation. I sat there reading those words again and again. Richard had written them years before his illness, long before I noticed anything was wrong inside our family. Suddenly, dozens of memories fit together like pieces of a puzzle. The vacations, the home repairs, the emergency checks, the school expenses, the birthdays. None of those gifts had been mistakes. The mistake was believing that endless giving automatically taught gratitude. Sometimes it teaches expectation instead. I closed the notebook and looked around the room where Richard had planned so many dreams for our future. I realized I could continue living exactly as I always had, hoping people would eventually notice everything I had done for them, or I could finally begin honoring the life Richard and I had worked so hard to build. The following morning, I called our longtime financial advisor and scheduled the first appointment available. It was not because I wanted revenge. It was because I had finally decided that generosity should be a choice, never an assumption. The following Tuesday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. I parked outside the small brick office where Richard and I had met our financial advisor for nearly 20 years. The sign above the entrance had faded slightly with age, but everything else looked exactly as I remembered. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a warm smile and offered coffee while I waited. Sitting in the quiet reception area, I found myself remembering the first time Richard and I walked through those same doors. We were in our early 40s then, determined to build a future that would never burden our son. We talked about retirement, college savings, charitable giving, and leaving behind more than money. We wanted to leave stability. When my name was called, I stepped into David Myers's office. His hair had turned almost completely silver since Richard's funeral, but his calm expression remained unchanged. After asking about my health and sharing a few memories of Richard, he folded his hands across the desk and simply said, "What brings you in today, Margaret?" I took a slow breath before answering. "I think I have spent years confusing generosity with responsibility." He nodded without interrupting. There was something comforting about speaking to someone who did not rush to fill every silence. I explained what had happened during my birthday dinner. I told him about the envelope, the check, the conversations that followed, and the growing realization that my financial support had quietly become an expectation rather than an occasional gift. David listened carefully until I finished. Then he opened my file and reviewed several documents before looking back at me. "Margaret," he said gently, "your financial plan has always assumed you would continue making large gifts to family members. If your priorities have changed, your plan should change as well." The simplicity of his words surprised me. I had expected complicated legal discussions or difficult decisions. Instead, he reminded me that changing my mind was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of stewardship. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing every account Richard and I had built together. Automatic transfers that had continued for years. Educational funds that were no longer being used. Annual gifts that had simply become routine. One by one, we discussed each item. Nothing was done out of anger. Nothing was done impulsively. Every decision was guided by the same question. Does this still reflect the purpose Richard and I intended? Some answers remained yes. Others quietly became no. Before I left, David handed me a folder containing updated documents that would take effect once everything had been finalized. As I placed it inside my handbag, he smiled kindly. "You know, Richard once told me something after Daniel graduated from college." I looked up with surprise. David chuckled softly before continuing. He said, "Our job is to help our son stand on his own feet. The day he believes our support is guaranteed is the day we have failed him." I sat quietly for a moment, hearing Richard's voice inside those words as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. Driving home that afternoon, I did not feel lighter because money had changed hands. I felt lighter because, for the first time in many years, my decisions were no longer being driven by guilt or obligation. They were being guided by purpose. When I pulled into my driveway, my phone lit up with a message from Daniel asking whether I would be available to watch the children the following weekend because he and Vanessa had plans. I read the message once, smiled gently, and for the first time in my life, I decided not to answer immediately. The message from Daniel remained unread for several hours. That alone felt unusual. For decades, I had built my days around being available whenever my family needed me. If someone called, I answered. If someone asked for help, I rearranged my plans without hesitation. It had never felt like a sacrifice. It simply felt like what mothers did. But that afternoon, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a novel I had purchased months earlier and never opened, because there was always something or someone else demanding my attention. I read 3 chapters before my telephone chimed again. This time Daniel called directly. His voice sounded friendly, almost casual. "Hey, Mom. I just wanted to make sure you saw my message. Vanessa and I have tickets for a concert Saturday night. We were hoping you could watch Emma and Lucas for a few hours." I looked out across the backyard where the afternoon sun painted long shadows beneath the old maple tree Richard had planted when Daniel was born. "I did see it," I replied gently. "I already have plans." There was a brief silence. "Plans?" Daniel asked, sounding genuinely surprised. "On Saturday?" I smiled to myself, not because his reaction amused me, but because it revealed something I had never noticed before. My schedule had never belonged entirely to me. Somewhere along the way, my availability had become part of everyone else's routine. "Yes," I answered. "I have something important to do." It was true. I had enrolled in a weekend watercolor class at the Community Arts Center, something I had postponed for nearly 10 years. Richard had encouraged me to paint after retirement, but I always found another reason to wait. There was always a birthday party to organize, a school pickup to handle, or an unexpected favor to provide. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Could you maybe change it just this once?" I heard no anger in his voice, only expectation. The familiar expectation that I would naturally adjust my life to accommodate everyone else's. "No," I said softly. "I think I should keep my commitment." Another pause followed. Then he cleared his throat. "All right, we will figure something else out." We ended the call politely, but I sensed confusion lingering beneath his words. Not resentment. Confusion. As though I had quietly rewritten a rule everyone believed would always remain the same. Saturday morning arrived bright and cool. I drove to the community center carrying a small canvas, a set of inexpensive brushes, and more nervous excitement than I cared to admit. Most of the students were around my age. Some had recently retired. Others simply wanted to learn something new. We spent 3 peaceful hours painting landscapes that looked nothing like the photographs we had been given, and nobody seemed to mind. There was laughter when colors blended unexpectedly, and encouragement whenever someone doubted their own work. I realized I had not spent time doing something solely for myself in longer than I could remember. When I returned home that afternoon, I noticed 3 missed calls from Daniel. A short text followed. "We found a babysitter. Everything worked out." I smiled warmly. It was such an ordinary message, yet it quietly confirmed something important. The world had not fallen apart because I said no. My grandchildren were safe. Daniel and Vanessa still enjoyed their evening. Life had simply continued without requiring me to solve every inconvenience. That realization settled over me with surprising peace. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer the people we love is the opportunity to discover they are stronger and more capable than they ever believed themselves to be. Almost 2 months passed before Daniel asked if we could meet again. This time he did not suggest a restaurant. He came to my house alone on a quiet Sunday afternoon carrying nothing but a small paper bag from the local bakery. I remembered these were Dad's favorite cinnamon rolls, he said as he stepped inside. It was the first time in years he had arrived without needing a favor. We sat at the kitchen table where Richard and I had spent countless mornings planning our future. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel looked around the room before quietly asking, "Mom, When did things change? I smiled gently. They did not change overnight, Daniel. I simply stopped pretending they had not already changed. He lowered his eyes. Vanessa and I have been arguing. I did not respond. Some silences deserve room to breathe. After another moment, he continued. Last week I asked why we expected you to pay for your own birthday dinner. She said it was because you always offered. Then I asked whether you had really offered. She could not answer. He rubbed his hands together nervously. I started thinking about everything you and Dad ever did for us. College, the house, the vacations, the kids. I kept telling myself those were gifts. Somewhere along the way, I started treating them like responsibilities. His voice cracked just enough for me to hear the weight behind the words. I do not know when I became that person. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. Most people do not notice unhealthy habits while they are living them, I said softly. They only notice them after someone finally stops participating. Daniel nodded slowly. I owe you an apology. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. What I wanted was never an apology. I wanted to know that your father and I had raised a man who could recognize the difference between love and obligation. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then whispered, I understand now. Before leaving, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and placed an envelope on the table. My heart paused for the briefest second as memories of my birthday came rushing back. He noticed my expression and gave a faint, embarrassed smile. Please open it after I leave, he said quietly. When the front door closed behind him, I waited several minutes before picking it up. Inside was a handwritten letter and a cashier's check for the exact amount I had paid on my birthday, down to the last 63 cents. At the bottom of the letter, Daniel had written only one sentence. I cannot change that night, but I can make sure it never defines the kind of son I choose to become. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside Richard's old notebook. The money mattered very little. The understanding behind it was worth far more. For the first time since my 70th birthday, I felt that the burden I had carried was no longer mine alone. Someone else had finally chosen to carry part of it with me. Several months passed before I truly understood that the most important changes in life rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, one ordinary day after another, until you suddenly realize you are no longer living the same life. Autumn settled over the neighborhood, painting the maple trees in shades of amber and crimson. My watercolor class had become a weekly tradition, and for the first time since Richard passed away, I found myself making friends who knew me simply as Margaret, not as someone's mother, someone's grandmother, or the person everyone called when they needed help. One Saturday afternoon, I hosted another dinner in my home. Not a birthday, not a holiday, just dinner. Daniel, Vanessa, Emma, and Lucas arrived carrying homemade bread, a salad, and a pie they had baked together. Daniel smiled as he placed the dishes on the kitchen counter. We thought everyone could bring something this time, he said. I simply nodded and thanked him. There was no speech about the past, no dramatic confrontation, no envelope waiting on the table. During dinner, Emma asked if I would teach her how to paint flowers, and Lucas proudly showed me photographs from his latest baseball game. Vanessa even complimented the lilies growing beside the porch and asked how I kept them blooming so beautifully. The conversation felt lighter than it had in years, perhaps because nobody was silently keeping score anymore. After the meal, Daniel insisted on washing the dishes. Watching him stand at the kitchen sink where Richard had once stood countless evenings brought an unexpected smile to my face. People do not become different overnight, but they can become more aware, and sometimes awareness is where lasting change begins. A few weeks later, I finalized the updates to my financial plans. Some gifts remained exactly as Richard and I had intended. Others were redirected toward a scholarship fund for local students pursuing careers in education, a profession that had given me purpose for more than 3 decades. It felt right. Richard had always believed that generosity should create opportunity, and now it would continue doing exactly that. I never told my family every detail of those decisions because they were no longer made to earn approval. They reflected my values, not my fears. Looking back, I sometimes think about that envelope sliding across my dining table on my 70th birthday. For a long time, I believed it had marked the worst evening of my life. Now I understand it marked the beginning of one of the most important lessons I have ever learned. Kindness is one of the greatest gifts we can offer others, but kindness without healthy boundaries slowly loses its meaning. Love should never require us to forget our own worth. Richard once told me that every family needed someone willing to keep setting the table. He was right. What he never had the chance to add was that everyone invited to that table also carries a responsibility of their own. Respect, gratitude, and generosity must travel in every direction if a family is to remain strong. Today, when I set the table, I do so with a peaceful heart. Not because everything is perfect, but because I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. Those are very different things. My 70th birthday did not teach me that I had lost my family. It reminded me that the strongest relationships are never built on obligation. They are built on mutual respect, quiet appreciation, and the simple choice to care for one another without taking that care for granted. In the end, that lesson became the greatest gift I received that year, even though it arrived inside an envelope I never expected to open. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.